How many times have you heard or read the 23rd Psalm? Perhaps you heard these words in a service, in a prayer, or even read them in a moment of anguish. His phrases echo in many places, cited in religious ceremonies, funerals, and moments of reflection. But have you ever stopped to analyze the true meaning behind these words? Do you really understand the power and depth of this psalm, or have you just skimmed it without realizing everything it carries? Many look at this psalm as just a poetic text, a beautiful statement to bring comfort when life gets difficult. But what happens when we start to look more closely at these words? Was it written just to console us, or is there something much greater hidden in every line? Since ancient times, human beings have had a fundamental need: to feel safe. In the past, it was the search for protection against predators, hunger, and enemies. Today, this search continues, but with different faces. We seek financial stability, we want our relationships to last, and we want health so we can live well. We want answers to questions that seem to have no solution. We want certainty in a world full of uncertainty. And when we feel like we have no control over our surroundings, fear sets in. What if I told you that within the 23rd Psalm, there is a secret that most people never realized? Something that can completely change your outlook on life, your difficulties, and your future. Something that can transform the way you deal with the pain and uncertainty that are part of our journey. These words were written by a man who knew pain. David, before becoming king, was rejected, forgotten, persecuted, and forced to live hidden in caves to save his own life. He knew what it was like to lose everything. I knew what it was like to have no guarantees about tomorrow. Yet, in the midst of it all, he wrote this psalm. In the midst of uncertainty, he declared that the Lord was his shepherd. He stated that he would lack nothing. How could someone who has gone through so much pain and suffering write something like that? How could someone who faced constant danger still assert with such conviction that God was in control? If you've ever felt lost, if you've faced pain that no one saw, if you've had sleepless nights thinking about the future, or if you've felt like you no longer had the strength to continue, then this psalm can change your perspective on all of this. David did not write these words because he was living peaceful days. He was not surrounded by riches or comfort. He wrote this psalm because he understood something that few understand. The presence of God does not mean the absence of challenges. It means that even in the worst of times, you will never be alone. Therefore, Psalm 23 was not written for those who are already at peace. It was written for those who are tired, for those who carry the weight of worries and anxieties, for those who face challenges that seem to have no end, for those who feel that their life is out of control but want to believe that there is something bigger guiding their steps. Perhaps, until now, this psalm has been just a set of familiar words to you, something you've heard so many times that it's become just a repeated phrase. But now, each section will gain a new meaning. Today, we will uncover what is really hidden inside these words. Let's look beyond the phrases we already know and understand why this text has spanned centuries, reaching people of all generations. Nothing in it was written by chance. Each expression carries a purpose. Every detail reveals something much bigger than we can imagine. When you begin to see this, you will realize that this psalm is not just a comforting poem, it is a powerful key to a new way of seeing your life, your faith, and your walk in this world. Now, take a deep breath, open your mind, and prepare yourself. What you're about to discover could completely transform the way you see everything around you. Throughout history, humanity has always sought security. Since ancient times, man has fought against hunger, disease, wars, and the uncertainty of tomorrow. In different periods, this search for provision was what drove empires, civilizations, and entire societies. But even with all the progress, with all the technology and advances, the feeling of lack still haunts many hearts. And it is exactly at this point that Psalm 23 begins. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. This statement was not made by someone who has never known scarcity. On the contrary, these words came from someone who knew what it was like to depend completely on God. David, before being king, was a simple shepherd. He was not born with a silver spoon. He had no special privileges. He spent years tending herds in the countryside, facing the heat of the day, the cold of the night, and the dangers of predators. In the culture of the time, pastors were seen as the simplest class in society. They cared for animals in isolated places, far from busy cities. It was hard work, but essential for the economy and the survival of families. The shepherd was responsible for ensuring that the sheep had food, water, and protection. Without it, the herd was vulnerable. When David declares that God is his shepherd, he is not using an empty metaphor. He speaks from his own experience. He knew that a sheep without a shepherd cannot survive. He understood that without the direction and care of the one who leads, the sheep are in danger. Throughout history, this truth has been repeated countless times. In times of crisis, famine, and war, those who trust in God have found a security that goes beyond their circumstances. One of the greatest examples of this is in the Exodus account, when the people of Israel walked through the desert for 40 years. During this time, there were no plantations, there were no markets, and there was no natural source of supplies. But day after day, God sent manna from heaven, ensuring that no one went hungry. This episode, recorded around 1300 years before Christ, is one of the greatest testimonies of divine provision. Even in an environment where nothing could grow, where resources were impossible to obtain, God showed that He is the true provider. But what does this provision mean in practice? Does it mean we will never face difficulties? Does it mean there will never be moments of uncertainty? If we look at David's story, we will realize that he went through countless moments of scarcity. At one point, he had to flee to avoid being killed by Saul. During this time, he lived as a fugitive, hiding in caves, depending on the generosity of a few allies to survive. But even in these conditions, he never lost the conviction that God would take care of him. This is the essence of this sentence: I will lack nothing. It does not mean that we will have everything we want, but rather that God will always provide what we really need. It means that even in the most difficult times, we will never be alone or abandoned. And this promise is not just a spiritual concept. Today, there are studies that show how faith directly influences the way people deal with financial, emotional, and social challenges. A survey of the Pew Research Center, carried out in the year 2020, showed that people who have a strong belief in God have a lower level of anxiety in times of economic crisis. This happens because faith teaches us to see beyond the present moment. It gives us the security that even if things seem difficult today, there is a God who takes care of the details, who knows our needs, and who has already prepared what we need to move forward. Jesus reinforced this truth in his words when he said, "Look at the birds of the air, which neither sow nor reap nor gather into barns, and your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not of much greater value than they?" Matthew 6:26. This means that even if we don't see the solution right away, God is already providing everything that is needed. And the question is, do we trust this provision? Just as a sheep is completely dependent on the shepherd to find pasture and water, do we trust God to guide us to what we need? History proves yes. Throughout the centuries, in every generation, those who trust in God testify that He has never left them destitute. Even in the darkest times, when all seemed lost, His provision always arrived at the right time. This is why David does not write this sentence as a possibility. He doesn't say, "Maybe God will sustain me," or "It is possible that He will help me." He states with certainty, "I will lack nothing." This certainty does not come from the absence of difficulties, but from the understanding that God never fails. That promise remains valid today. And when we learn to trust this, we understand that divine provision is not just about material goods, but also about peace, direction, strength, and purpose. Because when God is our shepherd, we can be fully convinced that we will never be alone. Since the beginning of time, the search for rest and peace has been an essential need for human beings. In a world marked by uncertainty, crises, and daily challenges, finding a state of tranquility seems to be a distant privilege. The fast pace of modern life, constant worries, and never-ending responsibilities make this search even more difficult. However, this need has always existed. The psalmist paints a powerful image when he states that God leads to rest in green pastures and calm waters. To fully understand the meaning of this passage, it is necessary to understand the reality of the sheep and their total dependence on the shepherd. In the biblical context, sheep are fragile and defenseless animals that cannot find the best places to rest on their own. They need to be guided. They need someone to lead them to a safe place where they can lie down without fear. David, when writing these words, was not just talking about physical rest. He understood that true rest involves more than simply stopping for a moment. The rest described here is a deep state of security and trust. Just as sheep can only lie down when they feel protected, the human soul only finds true peace when it fully trusts in God. This concept becomes even more relevant when we look at the world today. There has never been so much worry, anxiety, and emotional overload as there is today. Studies carried out by the World Health Organization indicate that stress levels have increased drastically in recent decades, affecting millions of people. Insomnia, anxiety disorders, and feelings of constant exhaustion have become common. However, this psalm shows us that genuine rest does not depend on external circumstances. It does not come from the absence of problems, but from trust in those who are in control. Just as the shepherd knows exactly where to take his flock so they can find food and rest, God knows exactly what is needed to bring peace to the heart. By mentioning green pastures and still waters, David is pointing to a place of provision and renewal. The color green, in the context of Scripture, is often associated with life, sustenance, and hope. In the desert of the Middle East where David lived, finding pastures of this type was not common. They were considered a rare gift, a sign of care and protection. In the same way, God offers this place of rest for those who trust in Him, even when everything around them seems dry and difficult. Still waters also carry deep meaning. Unlike turbulent waters, which scare sheep and can cause them to drown, calm waters are safe and provide renewal. In Hebrew culture, water is often associated with purification and new beginnings. When David mentions that God leads to still waters, he is talking about a kind of peace that cannot be found in human sources. This promise is repeated throughout the Scriptures. Jesus, in his words recorded in Matthew's Gospel, made a powerful invitation to all those who feel the weight of life. Those who are tired and burdened can find rest in Him. This rest does not mean the absence of challenges, but rather the certainty that there is a safe haven for the soul, a place where it is possible to regain strength and continue the journey. Many seek this type of rest in achievements, money, recognition, or momentary pleasures, but none of these things can bring real and lasting rest. This peace can only be found when there is true surrender. Just as a sheep only lies down when it trusts that it is protected, human beings only find tranquility when they learn to trust in God. History shows that those who learned to trust God found peace even in the midst of storms. The Apostle Paul, while imprisoned, wrote words of encouragement and hope. Even in circumstances that could have brought despair, he experienced a rest that was beyond human logic. This happens because the peace mentioned in this psalm does not depend on what is happening around. It is a peace that transcends logic, which manifests itself even when the scenario seems contrary. This means that anyone can experience this rest. No matter the size of the worries or the intensity of the storm you face, it is still possible to be led to a place of rest and renewal. However, for this to happen, it is necessary to allow God to be the one who guides. Just as sheep need to follow the shepherd to find food and shelter, We need to trust and follow God's direction to find true rest. This promise is not limited to a specific period in history. Just as God has guided people in the past, He continues to lead those who trust in Him to a place of renewal and security. No matter the external scenario, true peace is not in the absence of problems, but in the certainty that there is a shepherd leading each step. Difficulties are part of everyone's journey. Since ancient times, humanity has faced challenges that test its faith, courage, and resistance. Whether wars, illnesses, losses, or unexpected crises, there have always been times when uncertainty hovered over people's lives. In the midst of these situations, one of the greatest needs of the human heart is to find security. If you would like to support our work so we can continue to bring you more research and in-depth analysis, please consider making a donation of any amount. This contribution directly helps the channel grow and produce even richer materials. Thank you very much for your support. After talking about rest and provision, David introduces a new reality. He recognizes that even under the pastor's care, there will still be dark moments. The phrase he writes about walking through the valley of the shadow of death reflects a profound truth. Even those who trust in God will go through periods of trial. There is no promise that the path will always be easy. In biblical times, the image of the valley was very well known. Between mountains and steep terrain, there were narrow and dangerous passages where sunlight could barely reach. These valleys were risky places, where predators hid, where travelers could be surprised by robbers, and where the unknown caused fear. When David mentions this scenario, he is not just talking about a literal landscape, but any situation that brings fear, insecurity, and a feeling of vulnerability. The mention of the shadow of death reinforces the intensity of this period. In historical records, the expression shadow of death was used to describe moments of extreme danger, situations in which life seemed to be hanging by a thread. Many interpret this passage as a reflection of the battles that David faced, the persecution he suffered, and the moments when he was faced with the real possibility of losing his life. But, contrary to what is expected, David does not express despair. He does not write that as he passes through the valley, he will be consumed by fear. He declares something impressive: "I will fear no evil." This affirmation does not come from the absence of risks, but from the certainty that God is present. The confidence described in this verse is not based on one's own strength. It is not about human courage, but about a deep conviction that God accompanies every step. True confidence is not that which ignores danger, but that which recognizes that, even in the worst moments, there is a greater presence that sustains. Over the centuries, many stories prove this reality. One of the most striking examples is in the lives of men and women who faced persecution because of their faith. During the first few centuries, followers of Christ were taken to court, thrown into arenas to be devoured by wild beasts, and forced to deny their beliefs. Still, many remained steadfast, for they had an unshakable conviction that God was with them. This same feeling of trust can be seen in the lives of so many other people who, in times of difficulty, found strength in God. In the 19th century, a man named Horatio Spafford experienced a devastating tragedy. He lost his possessions in a great fire, and shortly afterwards, he lost his daughters in a shipwreck. However, it was in this moment of pain that he wrote one of the best-known hymns in history, "All is well with my soul." His words did not deny the pain he felt, but expressed the confidence that God remained by his side, even in the midst of the storm. This is the secret that David shares. He does not say that the valley will be avoided. He does not claim that he will never face the unknown, but he knows that, as he goes through this period, he will not be alone. The presence of God in the midst of adversity is what sustains those who trust in him. It doesn't mean that pain won't be felt or that fear will never arise, but it does mean that even in the most difficult situations, there is a strength that accompanies us. This verse also teaches us something essential. The valley is not the final destination. it is a place of passage. When David writes that he walks through the valley, he is not saying that he will be trapped there. He knows that there is a path forward, that this phase does not define his entire trajectory. History proves that those who remain steadfast in their trust always find a way out of the valley. Every battle, every challenge, and every period of uncertainty can become an opportunity to grow and see God's faithfulness in action. This certainty is not just for ancient times. Today, millions of people face their own valleys. Whether it's a financial crisis, a health problem, the loss of a loved one, or a moment of great indecision, everyone has a challenge that seems too big to bear alone. But the message of this psalm remains a source of hope. You are not alone. Confidence in the midst of difficulties comes from this awareness. Just as the shepherd never abandons his sheep, God never abandons those who seek him. This truth may not remove challenges, but it completely transforms how we navigate them. When going through difficult times, knowing that there is a constant presence accompanying us makes all the difference. True security is not in the absence of problems, but in the certainty that, even when everything seems uncertain, God remains by our side. Life is marked by challenges, and among them is the experience of facing opposition. Since ancient times, fighting opponents has always been part of the human journey. History shows that kings, warriors, prophets, and ordinary people have had moments when they found themselves surrounded by those who wanted to see them fall. David, when writing this psalm, understood very well what it meant to be faced with enemies. His career was full of moments in which he had to trust completely in God's justice to win battles that seemed impossible. By declaring that God prepares a table before him in the presence of his enemies, David reveals something profound about how victory happens. This verse doesn't just talk about triumphing over adversaries, but about a type of justice that comes from God, that happens unexpectedly, and that goes beyond what the eyes can see. In ancient culture, a prepared table represented more than just a meal. She was a symbol of honor, abundance, and protection. When a host invited someone to sit at the table, he was ensuring that that person was under his full protection. In times of war, when a king offered a table to a visitor, it meant that that guest was safe, regardless of what was happening around. This image becomes even more impactful when we realize that the table is not prepared in a place of peace and tranquility, but in front of enemies. This means that God's justice is not only manifested when everything is resolved, but even in the midst of battles. He does not necessarily remove adversaries outright, but he exalts those who remain faithful even under pressure. David experienced this again and again. Before becoming king, he was persecuted by Saul, a ruler who saw him as a threat. Saul tried to kill him, launched armies against him, and did everything to prevent God's plan from being fulfilled. Still, it was David who, years later, sat on the throne of Israel. The one who was hunted became the leader. He who was humbled was exalted. God's justice happens in ways we often don't understand in the moment. Joseph, for example, was sold into slavery by his own brothers. He spent years unjustly imprisoned, forgotten in a foreign land. However, the same God who allowed him to face these challenges also elevated him to the position of governor of Egypt. Those who once despised him needed to see him sitting at the table of authority, proving that God's faithfulness never fails. This principle is repeated in countless stories over the centuries. People who were rejected, discredited, and humiliated ended up being lifted up by God in ways that no one imagined. Divine justice is not limited to what is visible. It happens at the right time, at the perfect moment. Preparing a table also reminds us that victory does not just mean the defeat of enemies, but rather the manifestation of God's care in the midst of adversity. In the Old Testament, it is possible to see how God honored those who trusted in him. In one of the most remarkable moments, when the Israelites crossed the desert, God not only delivered them from the Egyptians, but also provided food, water, and direction. Even in a hostile environment, the table was set, and no one could stop what God had prepared. Today, that principle remains true. Many face challenges that seem impossible, situations in which injustices happen, betrayals arise, and doors close. In moments like this, it can seem like your opponents are winning, that the difficulties are consuming all your strength. But this promise reminds us that the story is not over yet. God not only brings victory over those who rise up against his own, but he does so in a way that exalts and honors those who have trusted in him. It's not just about winning external battles, but about completely transforming the situation, uplifting those who have been overlooked. The prepared table symbolizes more than justice. It represents security, provision, and recognition. When God puts someone in a place of honor, no one can stop them. David's trajectory proves that those who hope in God are not ashamed. Joseph's story shows that even when all seems lost, God is already working behind the scenes. Confidence in this principle transforms the way we face challenges. If we only look at the present, it may seem that the difficulties have no end. But when we understand that God has already prepared something ahead, we can follow with faith, even when everything seems uncertain. This promise teaches us that we do not need to struggle in our own strength to prove something to others. When we remain faithful, God takes care of every detail and places us exactly where we need to be. His time may not be ours, but the certainty of victory is undeniable. True victory is not just seeing adversaries defeated, but experiencing God's faithfulness manifesting itself in ways no one could predict. He transforms every situation and makes what seemed impossible become a testimony of his power. Life is full of challenges, uncertainties, and moments that are beyond our control. Each day brings with it new battles, some expected, others that arise without warning. Amid it all, one question remains: where do we find true safety? This journey through Psalm 23 showed us that the answer is not in circumstances, but in trust in God. From the beginning, we have seen how constant divine provision is. He presents himself as a shepherd who knows everyone's needs and who leads his flock to the right places. In times of scarcity, he remains the inexhaustible source that supplies not only what is material, but also the deepest needs of the heart. We also understand that rest does not depend on external conditions. It is a state of trust, a refuge that can only be found when we learn to depend on those who are in control of everything. The world offers countless paths that promise tranquility, but none of them are capable of sustaining true peace. And when difficulties arrive, when the valley of the shadow becomes reality, the certainty of God's presence gives us strength to move forward. The confidence David expressed was not based on the absence of problems, but on the certainty that God would never leave him alone. This principle remains true. He continues to accompany those who trust in him, transforming each struggle into a testimony of his faithfulness. Justice and victory over enemies remind us that God not only protects us, but also exalts us at the right time. The table prepared in the presence of opponents symbolizes an honor that no one can impede. Joseph, David, and so many others who were discredited and rejected became living proof that God transforms circumstances in unexpected ways. Finally, we saw that his goodness and mercy have no limits. They don't just follow us for a while, but for our entire lives. This promise has no expiration date. It doesn't run out. It doesn't wear out. It is renewed every day, and even when we fail, there is grace enough to restore us. This psalm is not just a beautiful text or comforting poetry. It is a portrait of real life, a reflection of the journey of each of us. He teaches us that trusting in God does not mean being free from difficulties, but being sure that we will never be abandoned. The question now is, how do we choose to live from this understanding? Do we continue trying to carry everything alone, or do we learn to rest, to trust, to surrender each step to the one who has already proven to be faithful? The 23rd Psalm is not just a promise for the past. It is an invitation to live in a different way, to see each day with a new perspective, knowing that there is a God who cares, protects, sustains, and guides. This is true security. and that's a promise that never fails. If you enjoyed the content and want to support our work so we can continue to bring you more research and in-depth analysis, please consider making a donation of any amount. This contribution directly helps the channel grow and produce even richer materials. Thank you very much for your support. If this message made sense to you and brought you a new perspective, how about continuing this journey? There is so much more to explore and understand. In the next video, we will dive into another topic that can transform the way you see your journey. So, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss anything. And of course, if this content was useful, leave a like. This helps us continue to bring messages that make a difference. Now, we meet you in the next video. See you there.